Hey everyone, welcome to my talk on ChatOps, how we automated the mundane in 2020. Today, I will take you through my journey, which started in mid-April last year, and led me deep into this world of low-code tools and automation. This talk is divided into three parts: the what, why, and how of the story. I'll also give you a brief introduction to n8n, the tool that we use for automating our processes, and share with you the workflows that we build. Before we start, a brief introduction. My name is n8n, and I work as the head of developer relations at n8n. I'm really passionate about automation, low-code tools, and DevOps. Before n8n, I have worked on a lot of DevOps and data-related topics around automating smart factories. Other than that, I love writing and have published books on Firefox OS, virtual assistants, and WebVR. I joined n8n last year around mid-April, and I was fascinated by the diverse use cases for which the community was using this tool. I talked to our community to get a better understanding of what they were using automation for and why they were doing it. So the answer to what was diverse. People were using automation for DevOps, monitoring, marketing, social media, IoT, backend of applications, and even on ships. This really blew me away. Now, the answer to why was a bit more coherent. And the common thread was making things efficient, quick, and easy. And this made sense. This wasn't very different from what I had seen when working with automation in smart factories. One day, I was chatting with a founder from our community. He was working on his startup, doing freelancing, and he worked full time as a management consultant. For him, automating things was primarily about maintaining mental health. He pointed out various mundane tasks that are repetitive, and performing them day after day was a drag for him. Sure, efficiency was a factor here too, but taking care of his mental health was most important to him. And this was an interesting revelation, and something that I could relate to as well. We all do things daily that can be automated and can free up so much mental RAM. Inspired by this, I set about to recognize these mundane things in our team's day to day life. And there wasn't a shortage of that. Part of being an early stage startup means that every day we'll have new processes, new projects, and things that can likely be automated. Now, the first step of doing that was recognizing the processes that were already working well. There is no value to be gained by automating a broken process after all. So, three prominent use cases immediately stood out, and there was a common thread among these. These were things that we initially did not foresee as time consuming. Over time, as we grew and started accelerating our efforts, these became mundane tasks, and we had other priorities as well. So, the first was pushing new n8n versions to the cloud. So, this involved marking the new version as beta, marking the previous version as stable, and removing the version before the previous version from the control panel. This involved working with the PostgreSQL database. The second was automating the generation of release graphics. So we have a new version released pretty much every week. We have a graphic with logos of some of the new integrations, which is published on social media. This involved things like compositing images and converting 2D icons to isometric images. And finally, we wanted a weekly update on the documentation coverage. This meant checking which integrations have not been documented, which need updating, and so on. Over the months, we built more automations like these, and that gave rise to the question, how do we manage all these from a central system and get information where it's most accessible with the least amount of friction? We also wanted to have fun while working with all of this, so that led to us embracing ChatOps. So we use Matamos, which is an open source alternative to Slack. We built a couple of slash commands and buttons, and voila, all the information that we needed flowed into Mattermost, and we could trigger things to happen from within Mattermost as well. So my tool of choice for doing all of this was n8n. For those of you who don't already know about n8n, it is an extendable workflow automation tool. Let's take a look at it. n8n has a fair code distribution model, which means that it will always have visible source code, be available to self-host, and allow you to add your custom functions, logic, and apps. Its node-based approach makes it very versatile, enabling you to connect anything to everything. Now, there are a couple of different ways to run n8n. You can run it using npx, npm, Docker, or sign up for an account on n8n Cloud. There's documentation on each of these ways in the quick start section of the docs. So let's do a deep dive into n8n. So first of all, we have the editor UI. So this is a blank canvas where you can create your workflows. Then we have nodes. Nodes are the basic building blocks of a workflow in n8n. There are two different types of nodes, trigger and regular nodes. So the trigger nodes can start a workflow and supply initial data. A workflow can contain multiple trigger nodes, but with each execution, only one of them will execute. An example of that could be the typeform trigger node, which will start a workflow when, let's say, somebody submits a form. Then we have the regular nodes, which do the actual work in a workflow. They can add, remove, and edit the data in the flow, as well as request and send data to external APIs. They can do everything possible with Node.js in general. An example of this would be the Mautic node, which can deal with resources like company and contacts and handle CRUD operations. Let's create a new workflow before delving into the use cases we talked about earlier. When you create a new workflow in n8n, it will contain the start node by default. The node cannot be deleted. So in case you're not using it, you can move it to the side. So let's say we want to monitor a website by checking every hour if it's up and running. In case the website is down, we want alerts in our chat tool. Right, so let's get started. So first of all, we will add the cron node, which is a trigger node since it would be starting the workflow. So we add a cron node to the editor UI. Gonna place it right here. And since we want it to run every hour, I'm gonna change the type of mode to every hour. Clicking on execute node runs the node, but this node doesn't do anything by itself, so we don't have any results here. Now we want to use the HTTP request node to make a request to a website. So for that, I'm gonna use the HTTP request node. So as an example of a website that we need to check, let's use the docs for n8n. Now, the response that would be returned would be a string because it would return the HTML for the website. So if I click on execute node, you'll see that it returns the HTML for this website as the data. Now, I also want other kinds of information. So I'll click on full response so that I also get the status code, error message, and so on. And when I do this, you'll notice I have some more things here like the headers as well as the status code, which right now, if we scroll down here, is 200. Now, in case the website doesn't exist, that will return a 404, but that will cause an error in the node. So because we do not want this node to error out in case there's a response other than 200, we are going to click on ignore response. So once we are done with that, we want to see if the response code that we got is 200 or not. So for doing that, we need to implement conditional logic, and we'll use the if node here. So we're going to add the condition. We're going to be comparing numbers here. So we're going to select number, and we want to see if it is equal to 200. Now the value that is going to come in from the previous node would vary depending on the URL. So this would be a dynamic value, and for that we'll use expressions. So we click on add expression, we'll delete 0, click on current node, input data, JSON, and here we see the data that was outputted by the previous node and is entering this node. And we select status code here. So this is an expression which for this execution and for the URL that we provided gives 200. And we execute this and see in the true output, we get all the data that the previous node outputted. And for false, we have nothing. Okay, so when the status code is 200 and the response is true, we want nothing to happen. So I'm going to add the no operation do nothing node here. Now, adding this node doesn't really make a difference to the workflow. It's here primarily for aesthetic or cosmetic purposes, and it helps visually understand, okay, If it's true, nothing happens. But if you skip this node, it wouldn't make a difference to the functioning of the workflow. Now to the false output, we're going to add a Matamos node so that it sends a message to a channel every time a response code other than 200 happens. So I'm going to connect this. Now, all the nodes which are talking to an external API that require authentication have option to enter credentials. So for instance, the Mattermost API asks for things like access token, the base URL. And in case you aren't sure where to find these details, you can go on the top here and click on Open Credential Docs, and these will show up the instructions for finding this information. Okay, so I've already entered the access token, and I'm going to select this. Now we need the channel ID of where to post this information. So I'm going to open up Mattermost and grab the channel ID from there. I'm going to copy this, paste it here. Now the error message could be error occurred. Okay. Now let's execute this workflow. You'll see that since the response code was 200, nothing really happened. Now, what if the URL is incorrect or the page is not found? So let's change this to quick start 1 and then execute the workflow. So if we take a look now on Mattermost, we will see that we got the message error occurred because it probably got a 404, as we see here. Now, to make it a bit more specific, let's add expressions so that we can specify which error exactly happened. So we can say here, response code, and then from the previous node, we can actually put the response code as dynamic data, and then add status message as well. And for status message, we're going to add what exactly it found. So let's execute this node again. And now if we go to Mattermost, we see it says response code 404, status message not found. So right now we were doing manual executions by clicking on the execute workflow button, but we want this workflow to run hourly. And that would be making it run in production. So for that, we'll just click on the active toggle on the top right. For doing that, we first need to save the workflow. So gonna just name it check website status. Save this workflow and then activate it. So now this is gonna check this website every hour. And depending on if there's an error, if the response code is 200 or not, it will share the error in the Mattermost channel. Now let's do something else. What if we want to manually check if a website is up and running from Mattermost? So let's create a new workflow by copying this one. So you can copy workflows, download them, and share them because all the workflows are essentially in JSON format. So I'm going to do Command A, Command C, and then new workflow. Then I'm going to do a Command V here, and it's going to paste the workflow here. Perfect. So first of all, we'll have to replace the cron node with a webhook node for doing that. So we click on webhook, which is a trigger node. So we find it here. So the webhook node would be the trigger node for this second workflow that we have. So let's save the workflow, and we're going to call it /check/command. So I'm going to save this. And now the webhook node has two different kind of URLs. So the production URL is used when the workflow is set to active, but what happens is when data is being sent to the production webhook URL, it doesn't show up in the editor UI. So it's not great for testing and debugging. So we are going to use the test webhook URL for testing and debugging here. So I'm going to copy this. Now we're going to create a slash command in Matamos. So we can do that by clicking here, going to integrations, slash commands, and we create a new slash command. We're going to call it check. And the trigger command would also be check. The request URL would be the webhook URL, test webhook URL that we received. And let's ask it to autocomplete. Call it check a website. And we save it. Perfect. Now we can go back to Matamos. Now, what we can do is, if we click on, first of all, we'll have to change the HTTP method here to post, because that's what the slash command is configured for. If we click on execute node and we click on slash check hello, as I press enter, you notice that this workflow is executed and we got some information here. Perfect. So now that we have our information, how the command would work is we would actually say slash check and HTTPS and some website. So this slash command would actually contain the URL of the website as well. So we have to edit our HTTP request node so that it gains this URL from the webhook node. So we're gonna edit this here and add an expression. And this is the text that we are getting. We wrote hello, but this would actually be a URL. And everything else remains the same. I'm going to save my workflow. I'm going to click on the execute workflow button again and going to enter slash check. And we got no response. So that means that the website was a 200. Okay, what if we enter a wrong URL? So let's take this same URL we took the last time and execute this workflow. So we do a slash check, and let's say quick start 1.html, and we got another message. Response code 404, status, message not found. So this is how you can create slash commands for whatever chat tools that you're using, maybe Slack, Rocket Chat, Matamos. And now let's take a peek at the 3 automations that we talked about earlier and how they look like in n8n. The first use case that we talked about was pushing new n8n versions to n8n Cloud. So this is handled by 2 workflows. So this is what the first workflow looks like. It's initiated by a webhook node, which essentially looks for new releases on GitHub. So whenever a new n8n version is released on GitHub, it will trigger this workflow. Then we set some information like the name of the version, is it stable, is it available? Initially, both of them are set to false. And then we do 3 things. First of all, we post a message to the announcements channel like, hey, there's a new version of n8n available. Do you want to release it to staging? Do you want to release it to production? Then what we do is these 2 nodes do pretty much the identical function, but they are talking to different databases. One is talking to the staging database and one is talking to the production database. If we open up this node, we'll see that we are inserting these new n8n versions to a table called n8n version, and we are putting in information like name is available and is stable. Now, let's take a look at how this announcement actually looks like on Matamos. So you see, we say n8n core release, this is the version number, and we have then 2 buttons, release to staging and release to production. Let's take a closer look at the Matamos node here. So with these 2 buttons, we also have an integration attached to it. So clicking on these buttons would essentially trigger another workflow. And this is the URL of the webhook of that workflow. Along with this button, we can set certain information as well. Like here we are setting, does this button mean a version should be released to staging or production? And what's the version of this n8n release? And we have similar settings for release to production button. So we can save some context and we can tell it which webhook to call. All right, so once a user clicks on one of these buttons, it starts this workflow. So this is a relatively longer workflow. Let's take a look at what it does. So this workflow is started by webhook, which is activated or triggered once a button is clicked. And now since the webhook gives in certain information from Matamos as well, like what's the username of the person who called this workflow, along with the context, like do we want to release it to production or staging, and what's the version number. After that, we have an if node. So we want to check actually if the person who clicked on the button has the permission to release a new n8n version to cloud. So here we check and we see if one of these three people, if the username matches, then this workflow continues. Otherwise, it says like, sorry, you don't have the permissions to do this at the moment. You know, if you feel like this is an error, reach out to these people. So in case the user is permitted, and start acknowledgement is posted on the channel. So it says release of this version to staging or production is triggered by this person. So this actually looks like something like this: release of 104.2 to staging triggered by Jan. Then this if node checks if the information that came into the webhook node, is it production or is it staging? So based on what the value is, and based on which button was clicked, either this or this, it takes one of these two paths. And the paths are pretty much identical, except that they're talking to different database, one to the production database and one to the staging database. So here we do a couple of things, such as like we get the version, we check if version exists in staging, and this might happen like there is no version because the previous workflow failed. So essentially, we added a couple of fail safes here. So in case, you know, a minor version is released like 0.104.2 or 104.3, or is it a major version? And just making sure like nothing fails, because this is making a change on n8n cloud. So other than that, what we do here is make the previous version stable, make the version before the previous version unavailable. And like we have added some custom JavaScript code to it as well. So you can, if you have to do some things which are not possible with nodes in n8n, you can use the function node where you can add JavaScript code. And once this is done, it puts a success message in the channel. So it says released version this to staging by Jan, or released version to production by Jan. So this is how we use n8n to build n8n cloud. So the second workflow that we talked about earlier was automating the generation of release graphics. So this is the workflow that handles the automation of those graphics. So before trying to understand this, let's actually execute this and then go through step by step to see what these different nodes do. So I'm going to click on the execute workflow button. I'm going to open up Matamos because this is a slash command as well, /graphic. And here we give it 4 pieces of information. And all of these are separated by a comma. So first of all, we have the new version of n8n. And then we have 3 URLs of images which are in a square format. So these are essentially logos of the icons that have been added to the new n8n version. So I press on enter and you see it executes this workflow and it's generating the image now. So let's start with what triggered this workflow. So here we have the webhook node, which captures the information that we gave via the slash command. Then this function node, what we do is we take the string that we gave it, which was separated by commas, split it into arrays and into a format that n8n can handle well. So you see it changed the 3 URLs that we gave into 3 separate records here. Then essentially here, it downloads images from these URLs. So here you can see we have 3 images And here's the 3 logos that we provided it in the URL format. Then the next node resizes it. So it makes sure everything is 400 pixels into 400 pixels. Now this is a multi-step node. What it does is nests the data or the image into a format that will composite nicely on our final graphic. Then we do work on changing the 2D icons into an isometric graphic. So there's actually, we resize it first, then we do shearing, and then we do a rotating action. So the image ends up looking something like this. So this is not 2D and straight anymore. It's in an isometric format. And from here, we actually get the background of the image, which is stored on Nextcloud, and like different assets. And finally, what we do is we composite these on top of each other, and we end up with a graphic that looks like this. So here we have the text that was provided in the / command and the 3 URLs that we gave. This workflow took them, resized them, and converted the 2D icons into isometric graphics and produced this. So this is how we generate our release graphics every week. The last automation that we talked about was how we use n8n to monitor coverage of our docs, because we want weekly updates on which nodes have not been documented yet, and also which ones need to be updated. So we use this workflow for handling that. So this workflow is triggered by another / command /docs. What it does is it pulls in data from a GraphQL endpoint that is exposed by our website. So we have a page, n8n.io/integrations, which lists all the integrations that a current version of n8n has. So it also has a GraphQL endpoint from which we can get a list of, okay, what are all the different nodes that are in the latest version. So we use that data to make an HTTP request, and the URL of the docs is essentially docs.n8n.io/nodes, and then the name of the nodes. And this name we are getting from the GraphQL endpoint. And now we are doing here very similar to what we did in the workflow that we created early on, is we are sending a request and seeing if it's a 404. If it's a 404, we know that a certain node has not been documented yet, and that enables us to know every week which node is not documented yet and what's the coverage looking like. So let me show you how this / command actually looks like. So here we have /docs. So right now we have around 250 nodes. So it's going to send a HTTP request to all of them and see if there's 200, that node has been documented. If it's 404, it hasn't been. So here you can see like we have the number of undocumented nodes, 10, current coverage is 96%. So 252 out of 262 have been documented. So this helps us keep track of how's the coverage like. We also have alerts if it dips below 95%, then we get an alert for our team. It's like, okay, the coverage is going low. Let's get that moving. So these were some of the things that we automated using n8n, and that has helped us a lot. So as the months passed by and we integrated more and more of this automation into Matamos, over time, automation became second nature to us. Funnily, it transformed into a Marie Kondo-like philosophy. Does it bring joy? No. Do we have to do it very often? Yes. Then that's a task that we should automate. Well, that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them along in the chat. You can always reach out to me at tane@n8n.io. We also have a very active community on Discourse. Feel free to join us there. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what you all build. Thank you so much. Bye.